Okay, so welcome to the Woodland, everyone. Our topic today is tobacco and schizophrenia, and we welcome experts and colleagues here to our webinar, and also those people who are watching the live broadcast and joining in via our Twitter hashtag, which is #ElfCampfire. I'm Andre Tomlin. I'm the chief blogger for the Mental Health website, and I'm going to be chairing the campfire discussion today. So the links between substance use and psychosis have been extensively researched over recent years, with many studies focusing on cannabis. But new evidence published this year has suggested that smoking tobacco may also increase your risk for schizophrenia. And clearly this is an important issue, with nearly half of the cigarettes consumed in England by people with mental health problems. So over the next hour, we're going to be discussing how we can best explain the comorbidity between smoking tobacco and schizophrenia. Is it a shared etiology? Is tobacco a way of self-medicating, relieving the symptoms of schizophrenia? Or, as recent studies suggest, is tobacco a risk factor for schizophrenia? So we're delighted to be joined today by three leading experts in the field. Professor Marcus Munafo, Professor of Biological Psychology at the University of Bristol. Dr. James McCabe, Senior Clinical Lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. And Dr. Samir Jauhar, who's a Research Fellow and Consultant Psychiatrist, also at the Institute in London. So the order of play for the campfire is as follows. Marcus is going to start and present his analysis of two studies from earlier this year, which support the possibility that smoking may be a causal risk factor for schizophrenia. And James and Samir will then present their recent systematic review and meta-analysis published in the Lancet Psychiatry, titled "Does Tobacco Use Cause Psychosis?" We'll then be following that with some questions from the floor. If you want to ask questions via Twitter, if you're watching the broadcast, then please send them to the #ElfCampfire hashtag. So, over to you, Marcus, if you want to share your slides with us.
Thanks. So I'll start by sharing my slides, if that works. So you should see those now.
Yes, thank you.
And I should say from the outset, my background is not schizophrenia. My background is tobacco use and the causes and consequences of tobacco use. But I've become interested in the relationship between tobacco use and mental health. And as studies have come out over the last couple of years, I've begun to be increasingly interested in whether tobacco use is a risk factor for schizophrenia. Part of the problem in this area, of course, is that unpicking cause and effect can be really difficult. So you have well-established correlations between, say, tobacco use and schizophrenia, but understanding the nature of that relationship is much less straightforward. So it could be, as we've heard, that smoking causes schizophrenia, that schizophrenia causes people to smoke, or that both are caused by common factors, confounding factors, other lifestyle behaviours, social position, and so on. And much of our interest at the moment here in Bristol is trying to unpick these observational associations and get a firmer handle on what's causing what, if you like. So in the specific context of tobacco use and schizophrenia, if we assume that there is a causal relationship there and that the whole thing is not simply due to confounding, which it may be, if we assume that there is a causal relationship, then crudely put, there are two possible mechanisms. One, which has been the dominant one over the years, is that tobacco use is a consequence of mental health problems such as schizophrenia, whereby people use tobacco to self-medicate their symptoms or to self-medicate the side effects of their medication. But there's another possibility, which has generally been of much less interest, if you like, or has been focused on to a much lesser degree, which is that smoking may itself be a risk factor for mental health outcomes like schizophrenia, through the impact of the constituents of tobacco that may have an effect on neurocircuitry and various pathways that are relevant to the etiology of diseases such as schizophrenia. And it's worth pointing out again that these aren't two mutually exclusive possibilities. Both could, in principle, be operating at the same time. But the difficulty we have is that we generally only have observational data to go on here. You can't randomize people as you would in a randomized controlled trial to smoke or not smoke. And the people who smoke tend not to be the same as people who don't smoke. So they differ in terms of their other substance use, their socio-demographic characteristics, their social position, their educational attainment, and so on. And all of those factors complicate our understanding of that relationship. So how can we begin to unpick that? Well, one of the ways that we've started to address these questions of causalities by using genetic information. And we've seen a proliferation of really large-scale authoritative genome-wide association studies over the last few years, which have interrogated the whole human genome in very large samples with very stringent criteria for statistical evidence. And these have begun to identify genetic variants associated with a host of different health outcomes. And what has become apparent is that sometimes those genetic signals that are being identified are not genetic signals for a direct effect of those genes on the outcome, but rather are capturing some aspect of our environment, some behavioral exposure that itself is having a causal impact on those outcomes. So we've seen, for example, genome-wide association studies of lung cancer, of COPD and emphysema, of peripheral arterial disease, and all of these show up one genetic signal that is common across all three diseases. Now, it's quite unlikely that a single gene would be influencing all three of these quite different disease outcomes. But it becomes clearer what might be happening when we look at what else that gene is influencing, which is heaviness of smoking. So that gene is in a nicotinic receptor, the alpha-5 subunit, and it very strongly influences how heavily we smoke. You can see the evidence there from the genome-wide association study for cigarettes per day, and for each minor allele that you possess of that genotype, you on average will smoke 1 cigarette more per day if you're a smoker. So the most parsimonious explanation for those genome-wide association studies of lung cancer, COPD, peripheral arterial disease is not that the same gene is independently affecting all three of those disease outcomes, but rather that that gene is influencing how heavily you smoke, and smoking is a causal risk factor for lung cancer, say, which we already knew, of course, but it gives us an insight into what these genetic studies might be telling us. So we've started to use that genetic information in what are known as Mendelian randomization analyses. That's where you take these observational data, these correlational data, and use the genetic variant as a proxy for the exposure that you're interested in. So rather than directly measuring the relationship between smoking heaviness and your outcome, which may be, for example, depression and anxiety or schizophrenia, some mental health outcome, you instead use the genetic variant as a proxy for smoking heaviness. And the advantages there are, first of all, your germline DNA, your genetic sequence, can't be altered by your environment, so there isn't reverse causality. And also these genetic variants, because of how they're inherited, essentially due to Mendel's first and second laws, shouldn't be associated strongly with the confounding factors that can complicate our interpretation of observational data. So what it allows you to do is to essentially turn your observational data into something that approximates a randomized controlled trial. You use your genetic information as the randomization, if you like, holding the confounders equal between the two groups and allowing you to somewhat more strongly infer causality from your observational data. So why is this relevant to schizophrenia? Well, last year there was a genome-wide association study of schizophrenia, which identified 108 genetic loci associated with schizophrenia, which was really transformative because, you know, even people who are very comfortable with the idea of schizophrenia as a diagnostic category accept that it's a very messy diagnostic category and probably captures a range of different diseases within that, if you like. So to have identified this many genetic loci, as many as we've identified for body mass index, say, is really striking. But the key thing here is that that same genetic signal that we saw for lung cancer, for COPD, for peripheral arterial disease, that chromosome 15 variant, shows up in this schizophrenia GWAS, which suggests two possible interpretations. Either that genetic variant is having a direct effect on our risk of schizophrenia independently of smoking, or that that genetic variant is actually capturing smoking as a risk factor, and that's why it's showing up in the GWAS. And again, those two interpretations aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Both mechanisms could be operating at the same time. So Susie Gage and myself wrote a commentary earlier this year to that effect, saying that this signal in that genome-wide association study was intriguing, and that we should begin to at least consider the possibility that that smoking may be a causal risk factor for schizophrenia. And that was borne out in part of Susie's own work on the relationship between cigarette smoking and psychotic-like symptoms, which we'll hear a little bit more about later. But since then, there have been a series of studies which point in the same direction. So you had, for example, a study by John McGrath in Australia suggesting that age at first tobacco use was associated with elevated risk of subsequent psychosis-related outcomes, and again, we'll hear more about that later. But two other studies, which I'll just describe in a little bit more detail. The first was a Mendelian randomization analysis by Bjørn, looking at schizophrenia but also antipsychotic prescriptions in a large Danish cohort study, about 60,000 individuals. And there they used this genetic variant on chromosome 15 as a proxy for heaviness of smoking. And they did this separately for never smokers and ever smokers. And that's critical, because what it allows you to do is test the assumption that that genetic proxy for heaviness of smoking is in fact operating via smoking. So if the gene is directly influencing schizophrenia risk independently of smoking, you should still see an association in never smokers. But if it's only operating via heaviness of smoking, then you should only see that association in smokers or in ever smokers. And that's exactly what they saw. The evidence was weaker for schizophrenia as a diagnosis because the numbers of individuals who had that diagnosis were very small, even in 60,000 individuals. But for antipsychotic prescriptions, the evidence was stronger. So that genetic variant acting as a proxy for smoking was associated with antipsychotic prescriptions amongst smokers, but not amongst never smokers. Again, suggesting a causal pathway via smoking. Then you had the study by Kendler and colleagues, which was an even larger, in fact, much larger study of Swedish registry data, which didn't use genetic information. It was a prospective longitudinal study, very nicely done, actually, looking at whether smoking initiation prospectively predicts a subsequent diagnosis of schizophrenia, but then also going through a range of different tests of the hypothesis that smoking is a causal risk factor. So, for example, including a buffer period before the first diagnosis of schizophrenia would count in the analysis, to take into account the possibility that symptoms of schizophrenia that emerge before you receive a diagnosis could lead to you starting smoking. In other words, the self-medication hypothesis. So protecting their analyses against that possibility by incorporating this buffer period before a diagnosis could count, if you like. And also including a co-relative analysis where genetically related individuals who were brought up in similar environments in the same family but who were discordant for smoking were the sample that was analysed, showing there that by taking familial confounding into account, both genetic and environmental, in that co-relative design, the risk of smoking for a subsequent diagnosis of schizophrenia was just as strong. It wasn't attenuated, or at least it wasn't attenuated considerably by controlling for familial confounding in that way. So testing the data in lots of different ways and arriving at the same conclusion. So we've gone from the received wisdom being that the relationship between smoking and schizophrenia is entirely due to self-medication, to this intriguing evidence that actually maybe the effect is operating in the other direction, perhaps instead of, perhaps as well as self-medication. And I think a key point to make here is that just because smoking is a risk factor, and we may want to talk about this later, we don't necessarily, we shouldn't necessarily assume that that's down to nicotine, for example. There are something like 6,000 chemical constituents of tobacco smoke. Nicotine is the one that we know most about because that's the addictive constituent, or at least the principal addictive constituent that has been very intensively studied. But that may not be the causal vector. It may be, and there are reasons to think that it's a plausible candidate. But there are lots of other constituents, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, for example, that we should also be looking at in that context. So that's everything from me, and hopefully there's a bit of time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Marcus. Yeah, sure. Well, let's open it up to the floor. Any questions for Marcus now before we move on to James and Samir's presentation? I think the question that I would ask Marcus is the kind of evidence that's building on this, and I'm sort of looking at this from the perspective of somebody who interacts a lot on Twitter with not just mental health researchers and clinicians like yourselves, but obviously also service users and carers and charities and all sorts of different groups. if this is borne out to be, the case that tobacco in some way causes psychosis, causes schizophrenia, how are we going to actually change our advice to service users? It seems to me that the self-medicating hypothesis is really deeply entrenched amongst service users. How would you?
To be honest, I'm not sure service users are necessarily where we should start. In that many of them do want to stop. As with smokers in the general population. I think it's often the healthcare professionals that need to be convinced, if you like, because they tend to consider smoking cessation as a low priority, despite the fact that it's the fact that people with mental health problems smoke that accounts for a good proportion of the reduced life expectancy that's associated with those mental health problems. So, helping people to stop smoking is going to have a dramatic impact on their longevity, on their life expectancy. But it's just not a priority for many healthcare professionals working with people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, say. So that's one place to start. It's also the reason for me bringing up this question of whether it's nicotine that's if we come to the conclusion that actually, yes, smoking is a causal risk factor, and I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think it's worth considering that possibility. If in due course it turns out that nicotine is not the causal vector, if you like, then that's going to have a bearing on how we consider, for example, electronic cigarettes and other nicotine-containing products and the use of those in these populations as an alternative to smoking. Because there's a lot of discussion, as you say, at the moment around smoking cessation in these populations, how we deal with smoke-free institutions and how we manage the need or the desire for these service users to smoke in those settings and what alternatives we provide for them. It's also worth bearing in mind that although smoking may be a risk factor, that doesn't necessarily mean that stopping smoking is going to help with that disease outcome. So, for example, once you've been diagnosed with lung cancer, although it's probably still good advice to stop smoking, it's not going to have a dramatic impact on your disease progression. So there's a difference between risk factors for disease onset, if you like, and risk factors for disease progression. They're slightly different things. But getting a handle on what causes what is the first step before we start unraveling all of that or unpicking all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very interesting. Thank you. So, any other questions for Marcus before we give the floor to James and Samir?
Marcus, could I ask one? It's Clive Bates here.
Hi, Clive.
Hi. Obviously, there's been a huge change in the amount of smoking since the immediate post-war period. Been a very rapid decline. Is there any sort of signal in the instance of schizophrenia that would, reflects the decline in smoking, or are we talking here about something that's probably quite one of maybe a minor factor, one of many in the sort of cause of schizophrenia?
I think you're quite right to say that the word cause can be misinterpreted here. It's not it's not cause and effect in the same way that one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball is cause and effect. We're talking about subtle increases in risk, if you like, and the magnitude of the effects that are indicated by the studies that I've talked about are far less than we see for, say, smoking and lung cancer. So if there is a cause, it's likely to be a relatively modest one, and one that would be difficult to pick up against those prevalence data. There are other problems there as well. Prevalence data tend to be measured inconsistently over time, and it's difficult to come up with to see a clean signal against that noise, if you like, in prevalence data. You certainly can find, excuse me, studies which suggest a decline in schizophrenia prevalence that roughly maps onto the decline in smoking, but I wouldn't necessarily read too much into those because you could equally, probably if you looked, find studies that showed the opposite. The difficulty is that the quality of the data don't really lend themselves to that kind of analysis, particularly when you're dealing with what are likely to be quite small effects overall.
Okay.
Great. Okay, thank you, Marcus. Let's pass on to James and to Samir now then. So yeah, James, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether you can see me.
I can see you. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll put on my my slides. Okay, have my slides come up?
No, not yet.
No. whenever I'm on Skype or any kind of video conference, I'm always reminded that I should clear up the shelves that are behind my desk.
No, I noticed that you've got PG Tips on your bookshelf, and Marcus has got what looks like a very expensive espresso machine behind him. So
Yeah.
don't know what that says about us, but
I'm looking jealously at that myself. Okay, here we go.
There we go. We can see those now. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to hand over to Samir really for the main part of the presentation to present the study that we conducted, the meta-analysis. But I just wanted to say a little bit about how we came to this question, and just a little bit of background about me. I work half-time as an epidemiologist, psychiatric epidemiologist, where I've been certainly following and occasionally making modest contributions to the cannabis literature over the years, and the other half of the time I work as a clinician, specialising in treatment-resistant schizophrenia. It was really as a clinician that I really got interested in this, because you only have to walk onto a mental health ward to notice that smoking rates in people with psychosis are absolutely enormous compared to the rest of the population. So these are just data from a survey done in the United States nearly 10 years ago now, looking at prevalence of smoking in people with schizophrenia, and it was almost 80%, and that compares to a prevalence of around 20% in the population. So it's about a fourfold increase. And whenever I talk about this, it's usually in front of an audience of clinicians and sometimes clinicians and academics. And I ask people from the floor, I won't do it today, but I ask people from the floor to comment on why they think this might be. Why is it that people with schizophrenia seem to be heavy smokers? And so these are some of the answers that often come back. So people say, well, it's because people are feeling bored, perhaps they've got negative symptoms, they're stuck in a hospital ward or in a very unstimulating environment, so they smoke. People talk about institutionalization and the fact that people, particularly when they go into hospital, become institutionalized into almost a routine of smoking, and of that as being perhaps one of the only meaningful pastimes on the ward in a very sort of understimulated environment. Some people talk about socialization in the sense that people use smoking, particularly again in sort of institutional settings, as a sort of pro-social behaviour in a way to pass the time with other people. And of course, people talk about that it might be to relieve distress and relieve symptoms, the sort of classic self-medication argument, and also other variations on the self-medication argument. So some people say it's to alleviate the cognitive deficit, drawing on some evidence that smoking might improve concentration, reaction time, and other things. Some people say it might counteract the adverse effects of antipsychotics, particularly the motor side effects. And again, there are some sort of theoretical ways that you might think the antimuscarinic effects particularly might have an effect there. And then to reduce the concentrations of some antipsychotics, because from pharmacokinetic means smoking reduces the rates of clozapine particularly, and some other antipsychotics as well. So those are some of the questions, some of the reasons why that people tend to cite, and it always strikes me that people just don't. It doesn't occur to people, it seems, that it might be the other way around. It might be smoking that's actually causing schizophrenia. Whereas when you ask the same question about cannabis, that suggestion is always made. Maybe the cannabis is causing the symptoms. When you ask about smoking, people very rarely come up with that idea. I mean, this slide is a variation on what Marcus has already presented, so I'm gonna skip over that one. One point I would make though, which makes it very difficult to disentangle the the effects of cigarette smoking versus cannabis is this fact that the vast majority of cannabis smokers also smoke cigarettes. So whereas the reverse is not the case. So so there are many people who smoke cigarettes but don't smoke cannabis, but there are very few people who smoke cannabis but don't smoke cigarettes. So that makes it very difficult to disentangle the two, and of course it's very conceivable that the findings that we have that we've had in the past in relation to cannabis could be confounded by smoking, and of course the smoking findings could be confounded by cannabis. So actually, on that note, the first sort of epidemiological study that I was involved in relation to this was a few years ago with Marco Box from the University Medical Center in Utrecht and Willemien van Gastel, who came over for a few months to work with me on some data that she had from the Netherlands. And this was a cross-sectional survey, an internet-based survey on predominantly students, people aged generally sort of 18 to 22, a few up into their early 30s. About 2,000 of these people, and basically it was just a cross-sectional study looking at the exposures that were looked at were cannabis and alcohol and other drug use and smoking, which was really only included as a potential confounder in the study design. And what we were looking at is psychotic symptoms in the general population. So just to emphasize, these were not people with any kind of diagnosis. These were healthy people who were students and who were responding to a survey, but we were measuring by a questionnaire, have you ever heard a voice when there's nobody there? Have you had a paranoid idea? And those sorts of questions. To our surprise, what we found was that when we, well, first of all, we did find that cannabis was associated with these symptoms, but then to our surprise, when we tried to adjust for smoking, we found that actually smoking, cigarette smoking, was just as strongly associated, in fact, slightly more strongly associated with the frequency and with the distress caused by these symptoms in healthy individuals. And when you mutually adjusted them for one another, it was actually the cigarette smoking, that was actually slightly stronger, and in fact the distress from cannabis use became non-significant when you adjusted for cigarette smoking. And around that time, just as we were getting the results from that, I attended a conference in Finland, and this is actually a very good example of how conferences can sometimes really set in motion ideas and further research, because at that conference, Suzanne Gage was there, one of Marcus's colleagues, who was at that time doing her PhD, and she was presenting data on associations between between cannabis use and psychotic experiences in the Alsbach study. And so I asked her after the presentation, did you look at tobacco? And she sort of said, well, actually we did look at tobacco, but we're not quite sure what to make of it, because tobacco seems to be associated with psychotic experiences just as much as cannabis is, and in fact possibly even more so. And she's gone on to explore that much further and has published on that now. And also at the same, I won't go through this slide because it's a bit, it'll be too time consuming, and I'm concerned about the time. But also at that same meeting there was John McGrath, and he was also said that he had some data on this, which he said that he'd sort of put on the back burner because, again, he didn't quite know what to make of it, but he had some data from a previous study where he'd looked at age of onset of tobacco use and non-affective psychosis and schizophrenia, and found that people with a very young age of onset of tobacco use, people who started smoking before the age of 9, or I think at the age of 9 or before, had about a 6.5-fold increased odds of developing non-affective psychosis, and that also in adulthood they were in the highest quartile of people with delusional symptoms and hallucinations. And again, sort of spurred on by these conversations, John has subsequently gone on to publish that, and it came out earlier this year in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. So that was the background. Actually, when we started on this to plan this meta-analysis, the genetic findings, the fascinating findings that Marcus has just presented weren't actually out yet, but that was the basis on which we started. So we really hypothesized that if smoking was a causal factor, then you would expect to find that that in prospective studies that smokers would have higher rates of or higher risks of subsequently developing schizophrenia, and also that at first episode, when people first presented with psychosis, they would be more likely to be smokers than controls. So that was what we set out to look at in our meta-analysis, and I'll hand over to Samir now, and I think I have to redo my screen share to get his slides to come up. So
okay, thank you.
Yeah. Can you see?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay, let's put it back to the start. Okay, so over to Samir.
Super. Well, I'm just going to talk about what we did, and just to give a little bit of background, this is one of those times when you write a paper for fun as opposed to anything else. It came about from a conversation we had after one of our meetings in our department, because I'd previously published on nicotine dependence and increased symptomatic severity in schizophrenia, and James had come back from this conference and was discussing those findings. So we're just going to go through what we did, and I think the main questions I need to reiterate were, at first presentation, are people presenting for the first time with psychosis having higher rates of smoking? In people who are being looked at over the longer term, do daily smokers have an increased risk of developing psychosis? And is there an increased age of onset of psychosis in smokers? And in people with established illness, do they smoke at a younger age? So here are the hypotheses that we tested whilst doing the meta-analysis. So excessive smoking, people presenting for the first time. Tobacco use associated with increased risk. Daily tobacco smoking associated with an earlier age of onset. And in people with established illness, do they start smoking at a younger age? This is the process. If you go to the Lancet Psychiatry, the article's there on open access. You can get access to it and read it through and go through everything. I'm just going to go through the figures and just give some context to some of those analyses. So I don't know if that's come out clearly, but it's just a flow chart showing that basically if anyone else goes through this, they could try and recreate it and they'd be able to access the same studies that we accessed, taking 61 studies at the end for our review and meta-analysis. So the first question in regard to prevalence, so that was 34 samples that came into that, and we found percentage of 57% of people presenting for the first time to first episode services were smoking. 57% is pretty high, but you wouldn't really be able to contextualize that unless you're able to look at the rates of smoking and controls. So what we did is we looked at case control studies, and we found an increased odds ratio of just about 3 there for people presenting for the first time to services. The next question, which I think is probably one of the bigger questions and the one that most people will ask, especially with regard to cannabis, when people look at the literature on that. When you look at samples of people prospectively over time, people who smoke daily, did they have an increased risk of psychosis? And if you look at the studies and the samples that we've got there, there's quite a spread. Now our finding is that there's an increased risk of 2, but if you look at the studies that are included, the one that really pushes things there is the Kendler one that Marcus talked about. And if you look at the methodology, it's probably the most methodologically rigorous out of those in terms of unpicking things. There are holes and caveats with all of this, but I have to say with this evidence, it was just a case of presenting the evidence and then making of it what you will. So when you look at those samples, it does appear to be an increased risk. If you look at them, there's quite a lot of heterogeneity between all the samples there. I'm happy to take questions on all these aspects once we've finished. So the next question, what's the age of onset of psychosis in daily smokers? So daily smokers develop schizophrenia or psychosis at an earlier age. And when we looked at the literature, again, it's quite heterogeneous if you look at the spread of all the samples there. But we found a weighted mean difference of about a year. So it did appear to be going in that direction to daily smokers developing psychotic illness at an earlier age. And finally, in people with established illness, did they start smoking at a younger age? Again, if you look at those samples, a large spread of samples, high degree of heterogeneity, it's non-statistically significant that it is in the direction of people developing psychosis at a younger age in the smokers. And that's really putting together all the results that we've got. I think the most important things that people can take away, I think, from the studies that we reviewed and meta-analyzed was the fact that a lot of things weren't measured. Other substances of abuse weren't measured in a lot of studies. A lot of studies just looked at cannabis as opposed to other substances, and the fact that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the literature. And it's probably building on what James and Marcus are saying about people's views on psychotic illness and cigarette smoking, and that people just probably didn't think about it or didn't enter it into the data when they're reporting their data. And from there, we presented the findings of the systematic review and meta-analysis, and in the discussion, we put forward a case for, well, is it possibly causal? For that case, we took the Bradford Hill criteria and spoke about various aspects of biological plausibility, dose response, etc. But I just really advise people, if you want to have a look at the paper, it's there in open access, Lancet Psychiatry, have a look and see what you make of it.
Great, many thanks, Samir, that's really interesting. Any questions for James or for Samir?
So it's not a question so much as a comment, but I think one of the things that comes out of that systematic review is that, in contrast to, say, the cannabis literature, there's just been much less work done. So we're starting from a much smaller evidence base, which makes it harder to be really confident in some of these findings. But that which we have certainly suggests, as I said before, that we should be considering the possibility that smoking is a causal risk factor, and then trying to build on that evidence base and extend it.
And I have a sneaky suspicion that some people might go back to some of their databases and have a wee look.
Yeah, exactly.
So what else, given that this is a small evidence base, what else is in the pipeline? What should we be looking out for over the next few months that's going to add to what we know in this field?
Well, so one of the maddening things about the very large genetics consortium that brought together all of these cases and controls that allowed that genome-wide association study of schizophrenia to be conducted was that many of those studies just didn't collect data on smoking status. And the assumption is that 80% or more of people with schizophrenia smoke, but actually those data are based on surveys in the 1980s, and at the moment it's still much higher than the general population, but it's more like in the UK of the order of 50 to 60%. So if we could split our genetic analysis of schizophrenia into those who smoke and those who don't smoke, in principle we might be able to get at this question of causality within this Mendelian randomization framework with a much larger sample size than was available to the Fu Anderson team that ran that study out of Copenhagen. There are limitations to that approach. That certainly wouldn't answer the question definitively, but it would be another piece of evidence. And so people are starting to look at whether they can extract that information from some of the studies, at least, that contributed to that genome-wide association study.
Mm.
Yeah, I think another area will be to try to tease apart the contributions of cannabis and tobacco. So one way of doing that is to look at people who smoke cigarettes but don't smoke cannabis, and that's actually something that Suzanne Gage did in her analysis, and that showed that the people who smoked were heavy smokers but didn't smoke cannabis were also at increased risk. So it did suggest that, at least in her data, the finding was not confounded, or certainly not completely confounded by cannabis. Another thing that we're pursuing in the Swedish data is looking at a substance called snus, which is the English name is oral moist tobacco, and it's actually very popular in Sweden, and it's a type of tobacco delivery which is like a small tea bag in appearance, and it's basically a pouch full of tobacco that you put in your mouth, and it's very commonly used by people who are trying to give up smoking, and a little bit like e-cigarettes here, some people do continue to use it, and so we want to look at whether that is associated with increased risk of psychosis. Another thing, of course, is question is e-cigarettes, which Marcus talked about recently. I mean, at the moment, in our clinical unit, we're a year into a smoking ban, where none of our patients are allowed to smoke on our premises in our hospitals, and we're very there's a strong drive to try to encourage people to smoke e-cigarettes. Now, clearly, from a physical health perspective, smoking e-cigarettes is far less harmful for you than smoking ordinary tobacco cigarettes, because most of the constituents in the tobacco smoke that give rise to the physical health problems are other than nicotine. It's the polyaromatic hydrocarbons in the cigarette smoke, the tar, in other words, that gives rise to your increased risk of cardiovascular disease and lung cancer. But I think a crucial question is whether these findings that we have with schizophrenia, whether it is actually nicotine that's driving this association, or whether it's other constituents of tobacco smoke. Because if indeed it's nicotine that's a causative factor, or at least aggravates psychotic symptoms, then it might be that encouraging people to smoke e-cigarettes might actually be doing them a disservice. And we've certainly got some anecdotal evidence of that from clinical, from my clinical experience. I can think of one particular individual who was a very, very heavy smoker of a very heavy vapor of e-cigarettes, and we found that he was somebody who would basically smoke an e-cigarette incessantly throughout the day, so that almost every intake of breath was through the e-cigarette. And of course, unlike cigarettes, with e-cigarettes, there's really no limit to how. There's no obvious time when the cigarette's finished and you put it out and you have to then go and light another one. An e-cigarette just keeps on giving, as it were. And so this man was smoking, getting through an e-cigarette, which is about 30 cigarettes worth in half a day. And we found that his psychotic symptoms became markedly worse when he was smoking his e-cigarette. And when we dissuaded him from smoking that, he did improve markedly. Obviously, that's just an N of 1, but that is something that does concern me about e-cigarettes and people with schizophrenia.
Do you want to come back in on that, Marcus?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, with e-cigarettes, that while they certainly are going to reduce many of the harms associated with smoking, there are a certain number of unknowns, and I think one of the really interesting questions is what place they will have within specific populations like mental health populations, and to what extent any harm reduction benefits that we see from e-cigarettes will necessarily translate to those other populations, and those are questions that we just don't have the answer to. So one of the, if we work on the assumption that there is at least a credible case to be made for smoking being a causal risk factor for schizophrenia, then one of the most pressing questions is working out what it is in tobacco smoke that is the causal vector, if you like. So looking at snus is an interesting angle, because that cuts down the number of, the sort of range of chemicals that may be having an impact. Unfortunately, for all the reasons that we've talked about, it's really difficult in epidemiological studies to look at whether, say, electronic cigarettes show a similar risk profile, because people simply haven't been using them for long enough. And schizophrenia is a rare outcome, so you need very large sample sizes to have a fighting chance of showing any association. So over time, we'll build up those data and we'll be able to get a handle on that. But in the meantime, we need to be thinking about laboratory studies, mechanistic studies that look at what the impact of these individual constituents might be on relevant mechanisms that we know play a role in schizophrenia. But I don't think we should just restrict ourselves to nicotine. Like I say, there are monoamine oxidase inhibitors in tobacco smoke that could equally plausibly be part of the story. But unpicking that is going to be a really important next step.
Interesting. I just wanted to come back to the point you made earlier, Marcus, about how we advise health professionals, or how we try and change health professional practice towards patients with schizophrenia and smoking practice. And obviously there's the whole issue of smoking bans, which is kind of getting rolled out across the UK at the moment. We're thinking about covering that actually in a future campfire session. Could you expand a bit more on that? What do you think should be done to try and change health professionals' views of this?
So I think it helps to be able to say that, that there's a case for thinking of smoking as something that has contributed to the disease rather than being a consequence of the disease, in terms of just reframing people's thinking and people's attitude towards smoking. And there's other evidence that's relevant that we can bring to bear here as well. When people stop smoking, it's not a pleasant experience. So there are mood symptoms and withdrawal symptoms and so on that are part of that process of stopping smoking and weaning oneself off. And that's part of the barrier to stopping smoking in the general population as much as in mental health populations. But what evidence there is suggests that when people do successfully quit over the long term, their mood symptoms, their mental health symptoms improve, if anything. They certainly don't get worse over the longer term. Now that's somewhat difficult to interpret, because there may be a degree of reverse causality operating there, whereby the people who don't experience the most pronounced mood symptoms in withdrawal are the ones who are able to quit for longer. But nevertheless, there's no particularly strong evidence to suggest that long-term smoking cessation in mental health populations leads to long-term exacerbation of symptoms or problems associated with management. There are some issues to take into account, like titrating the dose of antipsychotic medication that someone receives, because smoking has an impact on the metabolism of those drugs, and so if you don't change both together, then you can end up over-medicating patients if you keep them on their same medication once they stop smoking. So there are issues of management there, and that brings a certain kind of administrative and clinical burden to the management of those patients. But generally speaking, I think we need to just be reinforcing the point that smoking kills people, and it kills people with mental health problems as much as it kills people in the general population, and in particular in those populations is a really substantial contributor to the reduced life expectancy that we see in those mental health populations. So it's a really important thing to target if we want to improve people's life expectancy, and there's increasing evidence that it might improve their sort of proximal condition, their mental health diagnosis as well, and certainly no reason to think that it's likely to make things worse once you get past that period of initial withdrawal. And so one sort of interim solution to the concerns that James was raising, it might be that electronic cigarettes could help people to get off smoking, but then maybe they need to be weaned off electronic cigarettes, or even move down to zero nicotine electronic cigarettes. A lot of long-term vapors use zero nicotine liquids, so that they're not actually receiving any nicotine, but they're maintaining the behavioral habit and the action of hand to mouth and that kind of thing. So that might be a sort of balanced portfolio of recommendations, if you like. I'd be interested to know what James thinks about that.
Can I come in on that, actually? It was just a couple of things, just in keeping with what you've said. We showed that nicotine dependence was associated with increased severity of positive symptoms, and that seems to be a replicated finding. And the other thing that's interesting, with regard to people self-medicating for the negative symptoms with established illness, is that none of the drugs working on that alpha-5 subunit have actually had positive results. So those results are almost all negative. Well, actually, they are all negative for negative symptoms. So it calls into question in people with established illness whether it's actually helping at all.
Yeah.
And I think it's putting, it's the bits of indirect evidence that come along, and it's putting them all together, I think, that's going to change people's thinking. And again, it's culture, isn't it? And it's a culture within psychiatric settings.
And how much do you think that culture is changing now with the smoking bans and the guidance that's coming out nationally?
Well, that's a very is a very hot topic at the moment, and actually I was interested to hear you saying you're doing your next campfire about that, because we're actually doing a Maudsley debate about that as well our next Maudsley debate.
Fantastic.
Which just to give a little plug, it's going to be on the question, should smoking be banned from mental health units? And we've got Sir Simon Wesley, the President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, arguing in favour of the motion, and also Deborah Arnott, who's the Chief Executive, I think, of ASH. The opponents to the motion are yet to be decided, but we've got a couple of people that we've contacted.
We've certainly got a lot of followers on Twitter who'd be very interested in talking against that motion, I'm sure. So let us know if you shock people.
Sure. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we'll certainly plug that into what we're doing. Sorry. Yeah, I interrupted. Go on.
Well, no, I just think I think there is a strong sense certainly among a lot of service users and a lot of staff members as well, that smoking is something that is a patient's right. It's something that might alleviate their symptoms. It's often seen as perhaps somebody's only pleasure in an otherwise unpleasant and understimulated existence, and so there is a lot of concern about restricting people's smoking on wards, and I think there is a genuine civil liberties argument to be made against the smoking ban, because patients are effectively confined in hospital against their will, and as if that wasn't enough of an imposition on their liberty, they're also told to stop smoking cigarettes, which they would be able to do in any other situation. So I think it's potentially going to also lead to increased rates of people being involuntarily detained in hospital, section of the Mental Health Act, with these smoking bans. So that is another concern.
I think it is second only to CBT for psychosis. That's a controversial topic that we've had on mental health for the last couple of years. So it's definitely a good one for a Maudsley debate. We'll watch that with interest. Well, we've got to 4 o'clock, so we should finish the call. So thanks very much for everybody who's presented. Thanks to Marcus and to James and Samir. Really interesting presentations. Thanks a lot for doing that for us. And for the people also that have joined via the Hangout and also watch the broadcast, I've noticed quite a few people watching the broadcast and getting involved on Twitter. So thanks a lot for your time. We have forthcoming campfires coming up over the next few months on the mental health, looking at suicide prevention, cognitive bias modification, bipolar disorder, and also smoking bans, as we said, in inpatient units. And we're going to start to have some campfire sessions for our other ELVs over the coming months as well, particularly focusing on social care and learning disabilities. So keep an eye out for those on the website and on Twitter. But yeah, let's call it a day and sign off now. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.